What's going on, people on the internet? Welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to share with you guys of how I edit product photos like these. Let's get to it. All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Royce Lee, and today I want to share with you within Lightroom of how I edit my photos from start to finish, literally from the raw file itself to literally the point of export. So this has been probably a video that's been highly requested through some DMs on Instagram, as well as some, requests from some friends that I have of like the technical side of how do you actually do your stuff. So I figured, I don't have my presets for sale at this time, so why not show you guys how I edit my photos within Lightroom from start to finish. So if you're into this type of stuff, let's get straight into Lightroom. All right, so we're here in Lightroom. This is the photo that I'll be actually posting as of today when this publishes on my Instagram to publicize this video. So if you're coming from my Instagram, you're in luck of how I actually edit the photo. So as soon as I, preset this type of stuff, how I take the shot, what I straight go towards immediately as soon as I get this photo is the scale and crop tool. Now, immediately, since I already know that the Instagram does 4:5, I change this to 4:5 and adjust how the photo will look like per how this may look by the actual grid itself. Once I actually adjust that, I kind of zoom out and kind of see, well, I could probably make this a little more accentuating within the actual thirds. So what I do here is I go straight down, I scroll down to the transform section. Now within the transform section, I specifically mainly, don't really use the auto guided level vertical full. I know a lot of people who do use that. I know some friends that specifically kind of depend on those. But for me specifically, I take the shot of how it is, and then if I need the extra assistance, then sure. But for now, I like how they're presented, so I'm just gonna be increasing the scale so I can emphasize the subject a little more, make sure it's in the thirds. Obviously, make sure your whites, these white backgrounds don't actually display. So, make sure that's not there. Play around with your actual Y offset as well to make sure it's in that sector. And then right off the bat, that's what it looks like. Now, to really, I guess personally, to make the difference between person to person of looking at a grid, as a person who wants their grid to look super nice, what I do the next step is I go to 1x1s. Now, this is obviously not how I'm going to be exporting the photo, but this is how it will look like when the 1x1s is going to be looked at when your grid is shown for everyone to see. Now immediately that's kind of like the sign of, well, zooming out, does this actually look kind of nice on the grid? I feel like I could probably increase and bring this up a little bit more and probably to the side. So what I do here, I undo this, I increase probably the scale just a tad more. Like I said before, bring it as much as you can, bring it up or down. I think I said up when I said this before. I do the exact same thing, bring it 1x1, bring it back and see how it'll look like it may look. So before I should have done is decrease the actual the offsets to bring it down. So maybe that looks good. Bring 1x1 again. And then, you could kind of play around with it yourself of how you think it might look. I'd probably bring a little bit down again, so maybe I'll just bring it like that. That looks pretty solid itself. You don't have to be straight up in the middle of the actual photo itself, of the actual corners and thirds. As long as it's in that general area, I think, artistically it just looks pretty solid. So to each their own of how you want to look at it. I generally kind of just, whether it be like this small sector here, the whole thing, play around with it. But once that actual full photo is kind of set of how you want to make it look to present, now it's really time to play with your lighting. And that's kind of how my workflow goes. So I fix all that stuff. Well, the next step is to kind of make sure your lens correction is also correct. So then I look at the lens, fix it to be how you want it to go, of what lens you actually used. Because I have a Sony camera, but I have a Canon lens, if you haven't already, there's a link up top over here probably of, the 100mm macro lens is a solid lens for product photography. So if you look into it, if you haven't already, but I use the 100mm macro lens, it's the L series. Once you click that, it'll automatically adjust. Now, see if it actually works. What do you think it actually looks kind of good? If I look back, the vignetting is a little fixed and stuff. Doesn't make too much of a difference, but I feel like it accentuates it just a tad more of the subject as I kind of lean back in my chair. So I'm just gonna keep that as is. And now I'm gonna be going towards the actual lighting itself, which is your highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Now, the reason why I specifically go in towards this section itself is just because when I first made videos and I had to learn how to do color correction at the get-go, I learned the whole process of just playing with these first, and I kind of adapted the same editing flow process actually into my photos. So I'm gonna play around with the highlights here, and normally what I do specifically, I play around with the highlights because, and lighting, when I take my photos, I kind of make a small dungeon itself when I have just a little bit more light, just so I can get more additional details, so I'm not, overexposing, but I'm not making it so it's too dark to see. So, make sure, when you take your photos, play around with that first before you really depend on your actual post-processing. As I see the photo, I kind of like play with the actual highlights themselves. So maybe I'll bring it back because there's a little too much emphasis. Definitely want to accentuate the details instead of making things too bright. Because I'm in like a small dungeon type of deal, I kind of increase the shadows to kind of bring out what's in the background to kind of see what's in the foreground, background, whatever it may be. So I'll probably increase this to like 36, 40, somewhere around that range. This doesn't work for everything that I do. Sometimes I like to bring in more light if I'm working in the daylight sometimes. So, play around with the shadows, but for this photo itself, it's kind of on the darker side, so I'll increase the shadows. Now, seems like the whites a little bit too, like there's not accentuating a little more detail. So I'll probably decrease the whites probably like to this extent, maybe. And for this, because the blacks, I can probably adjust them. My normal workflow, I can use like the dehaze and exposure and contrast. I'll probably just increase the blacks for this one. And then you'll probably see eventually of when I come back to this to kind of a little more fine details. But for now, for initial color correction or lighting correction, actually, this is what I do. Now, from here, then I go to the tone curve. Now you can, use the actual line itself. It depends on the day where I guess for me of when I want to, but for now, I'm just gonna play around the sliders so you can actually see. I kind of just move back and forth to see if it's too much emphasis. I definitely decreased the highlights before, so I'll probably just increase it just a tad so I can play around with it in the future, just so like I have some room to play with for fine adjustments. Once I've actually played around with the lighting itself, you can play with around lightings one more time later on, but that's something you'll see below in the HSL stuff. What I normally move to next towards is exposure and contrast. So I play around within this section next. It seems a little dark, so I might just increase it. And for the moody sake of how I like my photos, kind of because it's more of the shadowy look and I really want to accentuate the whites in this actual cards themselves, I definitely want to make it a little more of a rustic, badass type looking vibe. And to do that, I specifically love to play with the contrast. I normally kind of shift it from like 15 to 20, and I'll just leave it to like 15-ish to kind of always give a little more wiggle room. Once this is actually done for the actual brightness and light levels and stuff of how the lighting works, then I now move on to the actual color correction. People sometimes play with the vibrance and saturations next. I kind of leave that as a kind of a general overall photo, and I kind of want to go in the finer details to kind of make sure my overall, like the finer details are fixed so I can kind of make the general basic corrections better in the later run. Moving on is the saturation with the HSLs. If you don't know what HSLs are, there's plenty of videos out there for technical stuff for learning how to use Lightroom, but kind of quick tutorial of what the HSLs are. Hue is kind of like your back and forth of how you want the color to sway. Saturation is the concentration of that color, of how much more you want it. And the luminescence per color itself is the lighting of, how much amount you want for that color itself. So you'll see as I kind of move towards this of how it's going to be, I'm going to be adjusting these, but how my eyes actually adjust. I specifically kind of see this photo as more of a red, orange, and yellow. Reason being is because you see in the background, like the wooden box, the cards themselves has like a lot of yellows, metallic looks, and there's a lot of darkness and blacks in here too. So other than that, there's no greens, really aquas, blues, maybe some magentas and purples, but generally that's kind of what I'm gonna be towards. You know, I'm probably gonna leave the reds because I definitely want the red box to be kind of accentuating there. So I'll probably decrease the oranges, probably a tad, maybe also decrease the yellows because I definitely don't really want these whites to be too urine-like color. So I'll probably decrease these yellows a good amount. So already at the get-go, you see your whites pop out. Probably from here, I'll probably decrease a lot of the stuff from the bottoms, from the greens to the magentas, just because I don't really need those in this photo specifically because red, orange, yellow, and the grays of this stuff is kind of the only things in this photo. So just take out the stuff that you don't need, in my personal opinion. So I'll probably decrease this amount, probably like significantly decrease the aquas and blues, as well as the magentas and purples. Now, the reason being why I do that, not only because of these colors that exist here, but specifically my eyes of when I, you know, use metals and like my blacks and stuff, like in my tables, I definitely don't like the aquas and blues. Some people do to make it more naturally look, but you know, that to each their own. I specifically like to just take out the blues to make sure that there's a little more accentuation and more of a difference for the colors that actually exist that matter to you. But you know, it really depends and play around with it of how your eyes kind of gear towards it. But now from here, you definitely want to make sure your colors are swaying towards what you want the photo to look like. Now, some people love to kind of play with the color grading and stuff to kind of adjust towards that colors themselves. I don't really play around with this stuff because one, I don't really know how to manipulate this to that extent, but for what I do, I don't really ever need to actually ever touch it where I'm like not satisfied. So, but that's just me. I don't really play around with that. I usually play around with the hues, and specifically here, I probably wanna remove some of the red just a tad, so I'll probably sway it towards the left side. For the orange, probably also I'll sway it towards the reds because maybe like this, but 100% because of the yellows are kind of shifted because the orange is swaying towards the left side to the reds. Probably increase this as well. Probably not too far. Pretty okay for what it looks like. I'll probably eventually want to make somehow these whites accentuate for the actual cards to make it not so, I guess, urine color. So that's kind of the plan here. I don't really sway these too much for the greens, aquas, blues, purples, magentas for the hues, just because I've already minimized it a lot within the saturation. So there's really no need to play around with those. Now for the luminescence, I don't really play around with this too much either because, I play around with the highlights and stuff a decent amount, and I've already know prior to my photos when I take it of the lighting itself. So this can be playing around with this to your kind of your desire, kind of see what it actually changes from like extremes and whatnot. So I'll try to put this to like -12 for now and maybe increase these a tad or maybe decrease this. Probably just increase it just a tad more. You can decrease these if you really want. It doesn't seem like it does too much. So that's kind of where I leave that for the luminescence. For the colors, moving on to the additional colors, this is where the calibration starts. I have my presets where it's already done for me, but because I'm swaying for the red, orange, and yellow, I mainly am looking at the red primary and probably to equalize it, I'd use the greens and probably decrease the blues. So I'll probably increase this to like towards the orange of like the 15 range. It's maybe like 20-ish, yeah, something like that. Probably decrease it so it's not too pungent. Definitely increase the greens to kind of equalize the reds. So maybe I'll probably to bring it to like 30-ish, maybe more, depending on what this looks like. This probably looks kind of solid, maybe like 40, 42, decrease the saturations, and probably that's about it. And I don't really see myself right now switching towards the blue primaries because I really want to focus on the reds. Now, pretty much from here, it's a lot of focusing and kind of fine adjustments. We already focused on the actual lighting, the proper HSLs, the calibrations themselves. We already looked at the scaling and how the photo actually look. So now here is making the subject pop. That's the biggest thing I feel like once you want to differentiate. So here, you definitely want the masking tool. Great tool that Adobe has made was the AI of the select subject tool. This is probably my favorite thing to figure out how to make your subject pop. So immediately press that and it automatically scans the whole photo to see what the actual things are in focus. Now you want to probably adjust this to your liking of adding and subtracting per the brush and stuff, but you know, this is a great, masking is a great tool. I usually have probably like from 2 to 5 for each photo to kind of accentuate the subject from the background and whatnot. So play around with it with your subject, but for what I do, I definitely play with the shadows a lot more, probably the whites again, and the blacks to make sure like the thing actually pops. My tidbit to kind of compensate the compression and that Facebook and Instagram does, you know, play with the textures. I add a little bit more sharpness and textures. Maybe in this photo, I kind of decrease the saturation just a tad bit because it looks a little bit unnatural. And then to make it a little moody, I give the contrast and maybe decrease the exposure and probably increase the highlights just a tad. So it looks pretty solid. If you want, you can accentuate this more on the dehaze. I think that's pretty solid to make this more of a crisper look and moody look. So once that's done, then you got your subject. And then from here, what I like to do is duplicate and inverse the mask. This is literally how you really make the thing pop. So right here, I have it as show an overlay. This literally inverts it so everything else is scanned. And what I do here is kind of make sure that the subject is popped. So I kind of darken the rest of the stuff. So you can probably dehaze that, probably increase the contrast, decrease the exposure just a tad more, probably decrease the highlights just so you don't focus on the background too much and you want to really focus on the subject of making it pop. And then if you want to really make things more of an accentuate, maybe you can decrease the clarity. You don't really have to play around with the sharpness too much, but sometimes I play around just a tad bit of minimizing that. And you can probably decrease the shadows if you really want to accentuate it, but I've seen it a little bit too unnatural, so I'll just probably bring it down to like 7. So after that, you can make your finer tune adjustments of the actual more maskings of like, you know, your linear tool, your brushes and stuff. But for the types of purpose of this tutorial, this is pretty much what I do from start to finish. Your lighting, your color correction, how it's presented, as well as just the finer adjustments. Now from here, you know, you can play around with the highlights again, just at the overall photo, what it looks like. It seems like it probably can increase the highlights themselves, decrease the shadows, increase the whites a little bit, and then maybe add a little more texture and minimize some saturation, just so it's not too pungent to your eye. So once you export, make sure, you know, like you don't make it too moody if you're gonna go for this type of mood. But for all intents and purposes, you know, this is how I edit my photos, my workflow, what I do for my product photography. So hopefully you enjoy this type of video. You know, if you like these types of technical stuff, feel free to leave a comment down below. Feel free to DM me of like how I edit my videos or something like that. I've gotten that before, so feel free to reach out. I love to make and explain all this stuff, what I do specifically. So, you know, it'd be much appreciated if you like, comment, subscribe to this video. It'll be much appreciated for this channel. And yeah, wherever you are, hope you have a blessed day and God bless. Peace.